2 Apache women was found in the cold. The rancher took them in, gave them a shelter they needed. The wind howled through the barren plains, biting at Jack Lawson's face as he rode his horse across the snow-covered land. It was the kind of winter day where the world felt frozen, the cold seeping into your bones no matter how many layers of clothing you wore. Jack had grown used to the loneliness of the frontier. He didn't mind it. A man like him had always preferred the quiet, the open land, and the company of the animals he tended to on his ranch. There was no one else for miles except the occasional traveler or rancher passing through. Today, though, was different. As Jack rode back to his cabin, something caught his eye, a shadow in the distance. He pulled his horse to a stop, narrowing his eyes against the sharp wind. 2 figures, barely visible through the swirling snow, stumbled slowly across the land.
Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were women.
And from the looks of it, they were in trouble. He turned his horse toward them, urging it forward through the deep snow. As he drew closer, he could see their faces. Pale and tired, their clothes ragged from the cold. The older woman's dark eyes were wide, filled with fear, while the younger one stumbled slightly, struggling to keep her balance in the heavy snow. Jack pulled his horse to a stop beside them, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff from the wind. The older woman's eyes flickered toward him, but she said nothing. The younger woman's lips parted, but her words were barely a whisper. "Cold, we're so cold," she muttered, her voice trembling. Jack's heart softened. He had seen hardship on the frontier, but this was different. He could tell they were far from any settlement, and the storm wasn't letting up. The snow was coming down heavier by the minute. "You're too far from town. You won't make it like this," Jack said firmly. "Come with me. I've got a cabin not far from here. You can warm up there." The older woman hesitated, but Jack didn't wait for her response. He dismounted from his horse and helped the younger woman onto it, leading the animals slowly through the snow. The older woman followed, walking beside them. It was clear they were exhausted, and Jack could see the faint signs of frostbite on their exposed skin. They needed help. By the time they reached his cabin, the storm had worsened. Snow was piling up quickly, covering the ground like a thick blanket. Jack pushed open the door to his modest home and led the women inside, where the warmth of the fire waiting on the hearth offered them a much-needed relief. "Sit by the fire. I'll get you something to eat," Jack said as he closed the door, sealing out the storm. The women sank into the chairs by the fire, their movements stiff from the cold. Jack could see the tension in their faces, the way they looked at him with cautious eyes, as if unsure of whether they could trust him. He didn't blame them. The world they lived in wasn't kind to strangers, especially not to women from a different tribe. Jack had heard rumors of tension between the local settlers and the Apache, though he kept his distance from politics. He quickly put some soup on the stove, the comforting smell filling the small cabin. As it heated, he took a seat across from the women, his eyes flickering between them. The older woman remained quiet, her eyes glued to the fire. The younger one, who had been sitting with her head bowed, finally raised her eyes to meet his. "Thank you," she said, softly, her voice hoarse. We didn't know where to go. We had no choice." Jack nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "You're safe now. You can rest here until the storm passes." There was a long silence before the older woman spoke, her voice surprisingly steady despite the exhaustion in her face. "We're not what you think," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that caught him off guard. "We didn't come here to cause trouble." Jack raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He knew better than to ask too many questions, especially with people like them, strangers with a story to tell, but only when they were ready. The younger woman, who had been looking at the floor, finally spoke again. "We are Apache. We've been running for days. The snow caught us and we got lost. It's a long story." Jack was quiet for a moment, his gaze softening. It wasn't unusual for Apache to pass through this area, but it was rare to see women alone, especially not in the middle of a storm like this. Something wasn't adding up, but Jack had no intention of pushing them. He had been alone too long himself to not understand the need for solitude, and the weight of their silence spoke volumes. "Rest for now," Jack said, standing up to check on the soup. "We'll talk when you're ready." The 2 women nodded, and the younger one let her head fall back against the chair, her eyes closing. The older woman remained quiet, staring into the flames. Jack worked quietly in the kitchen, trying to give the women some space. But as he glanced back at them, he couldn't shake the feeling that their appearance at his cabin wasn't just a random act of fate. There was something more to their story, something they weren't telling him. When the soup was ready, Jack served it up in bowls and handed them to the women, who accepted it without a word. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. After a while, Jack finished his meal and stood up, moving to the window to peer out into the snowstorm. He could barely see beyond the porch, the snowflakes swirling so thickly that it felt like the world had disappeared. Turning back to the women, Jack spoke again, his voice softer now. "You'll be safe here until the storm lets up, but you'll need to tell me what happened, sooner or later. I can't help you if I don't know what you're running from." The older woman's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? But then she simply nodded. "I'll tell you when the time's right," she said quietly. Jack didn't press. Instead, he settled into the chair across from them, leaning back and allowing the warmth of the fire to fill the room. The storm outside raged on, but for now, the cabin was quiet, safe, and warm. And for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't feel so alone. The snowstorm continued to rage outside Jack's cabin, but inside, the warmth of the fire provided a sense of peace that neither of the two women had felt in days. They had fallen into a quiet rhythm since their arrival. Silent meals, shared glances, and the occasional nod. Jack didn't rush them to speak, but he could feel their silence growing heavier with each passing hour. Taya, the older woman, had settled into a chair by the fire and hardly moved. Her dark eyes seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of hardship. She was always the first to retreat into herself when the storm became too loud, and Jack noticed how her fingers would twitch, as though she were trying to keep herself from reaching for something she didn't have anymore. Sakari, the younger woman, was more animated, though still guarded. Jack helped around the cabin, folding blankets and stoking the fire, though her hands trembled from exhaustion. Jack had seen it before. People too tired to show their true feelings, but unable to hide their weariness. Over the next few days, the snowstorm didn't let up, and the temperature dropped even lower. They spent most of the time inside, sitting by the fire or sleeping. Jack did his best to keep the cabin stocked with food, but he could sense that both women were struggling with more than just the cold. One evening after they had finished another quiet meal, Sakari stood up and moved toward the window, her gaze far away. Jack could see her fingers twitching nervously at her side. Taya sat silently as ever, her eyes never leaving the fire. "You know, we should be leaving soon," Sakari spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet it broke the silence like a crack of thunder. Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "It's still storming out there." "You'd never make it." Sakari's gaze didn't leave the snowstorm outside. "We can't stay here forever," she said, her voice low but firm. "It's dangerous." Jack stood up slowly, sensing the tension in her words. "Dangerous for you or for me?" he asked, his tone cautious. He could tell that there was more going on than she was letting on. Sakari hesitated, then turned to face him. "For both of us," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and something else, something darker. Taya, who had been silent until then, stood up and walked toward them. She placed a hand on Sakari's shoulder as if to steady her. "You shouldn't worry him," she said, her voice stern but caring. "He's done enough for us." Jack watched the exchange, his curiosity growing. There was more to their story than they were willing to share, and he had a feeling that once he heard it, things might change. But for now, he held back, letting the silence fill the room again. The next morning, the snowstorm showed no signs of stopping. Jack was outside chopping wood for the fire when he noticed Sakari watching him from the doorway. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "We can take care of ourselves. You've done enough." Jack paused, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cold. "You're welcome to help if you want," he said, turning to face her. "But you're right, you don't have to do anything if you don't want to." Sakari stepped closer, her voice softening. "It's just, we don't want to be a burden. We've already cost you so much." Jack shook his head, feeling a strange knot in his stomach. "You're no burden." "But something's been bothering me," he said, his voice more serious now. "You keep talking like you're on the run from something. What happened? What's chasing you?" Sakari's expression changed in an instant. Fear flashed in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. She stepped back, as if unsure whether she could trust him with the truth. "It's not something you want to be involved in," she said quietly, shaking her head. Taya appeared behind her, her voice low but commanding. "Don't listen to her. We can't stay here forever, but we don't want trouble for you." Jack felt the weight of their words pressing down on him. He had a sense that this wasn't just some random incident. These women were running from something serious. He walked toward them slowly, looking directly at Taya. "I don't want trouble either, but if it's out there, it'll find us eventually." Taya met his gaze, and For the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes. "We know," she said quietly, "but it's not something you can fight. You're better off not knowing." The tension in the air was thick. Jack could tell they weren't going to reveal everything, but he didn't want to push them. They had been through enough already. "All right," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You stay here as long as you need. I'm not sending you back out into that storm, but when you're ready to talk, I'll be here." Sakari nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. Taya, on the other hand, just turned and walked back inside the cabin without another word. That night, after a quiet meal, Jack sat by the fire, deep in thought. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something dark was just beyond the horizon. Whatever the women were running from, it wasn't over, and Jack had a sinking feeling that it was only a matter of time before it caught up to them. The next day, the storm began to let up, but Jack still wasn't sure if they should leave. The land outside was treacherous, and he wasn't sure what kind of danger might await them beyond the cabin. As he worked around the ranch, doing the usual chores, Jack kept an eye on the women. They were quieter now, their movements more subdued, as if waiting for something they knew was coming. Sakari had been more distant lately, and Jack could see that she was struggling with something. Taya, on the other hand, hadn't said much since their conversation about the danger. Jack knew they were both hiding something that had kept them on the run. As evening drew near, Jack made a decision. He couldn't stay in the dark forever. He had to know what he was protecting. If it was as dangerous as he suspected, he might need to make plans for the worst. He waited for the women to settle by the fire, the warm glow casting shadows across their faces. As they sat quietly, Jack spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk. I can't keep living in the dark," he said, his gaze steady. "Tell me what's going on." The room grew quiet. Taya and Sakari exchanged a look, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Finally, Taya spoke. "We'll tell you, but not tonight." Jack nodded, understanding that the moment wasn't right. But he also knew it was only a matter of time before they couldn't keep running from their past. The snow had finally started to melt, leaving behind a cold, wet mess of mud and puddles that clung to the land like a thick blanket. Jack Lawson's ranch was quiet once again, the usual hum of animals and chores returning to the daily rhythm. But the peace he had found in the past days was fragile, like a glass that might shatter at any moment. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Taya and Sakari had barely spoken of their past since the storm had passed. They had settled into a routine, helping with chores, staying close to the cabin, and avoiding the subject that hung over them like a storm cloud. Jack had given them space, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. He had the feeling that they were waiting for something, and he wasn't sure what that was. One afternoon, as Jack worked in the barn, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. His heart skipped a beat, and he froze. He wasn't expecting any visitors, not with the winter still clinging to the land. He grabbed his rifle from the corner of the barn and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The sound grew louder, and soon he could make out the shapes of riders moving through the mud. 3 men. They were moving quickly, their horses galloping through the muck, and Jack's instincts kicked in. He knew something wasn't right. These men weren't just passing through, they were looking for something. Jack crouched low behind the barn, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. The men were getting closer, and he could hear their voices now, rough and cold. They were speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, but the tone was clear, urgent, demanding. Taya and Sakari were inside the cabin, safe for the moment, but Jack knew that would change once these men reached his property. He had to act fast. He watched as the riders came closer, their horses kicking up mud as they rode in his direction. His heart pounded in his chest. The men were closing in on the cabin. Jack gritted his teeth. There was no time to waste. He moved silently through the barn, gathering his gear and preparing for what he feared was coming. The men had no idea that he was watching, but Jack wasn't about to let them find what they were looking for. The riders reached the edge of his property and slowed to a stop. They dismounted, their boots sinking into the wet earth as they surveyed the area. Jack stayed hidden, watching them carefully. He knew the danger had just arrived. The leader of the group, a tall man with a weathered face and dark eyes, pointed toward the cabin. "Search the place," he commanded. Jack's heart sank. They weren't just looking for something. They were looking for someone. His eyes flicked toward the cabin. Taya and Sakari were inside, unarmed, vulnerable. Jack had to protect them, but he couldn't do it alone. He moved quickly and quietly, making his way toward the cabin without being seen. The men were too focused on their search to notice him. But Jack knew it wouldn't be long before they found the women. When he reached the cabin, he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. Taya and Sakari were sitting by the fire, their faces tense with the knowledge that something was wrong. Jack didn't say anything. He simply motioned for them to follow him. They stood up immediately, understanding the danger without a word. Sakari grabbed a rifle from the corner of the cabin, her hands shaking, while Taya moved silently toward the back door. "We need to get to the woods," Jack whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Stay quiet and stay close." They moved quickly, sneaking out the back door and into the trees. The woods were thick with underbrush, and the sound of the men's voices grew fainter as they moved further away from the cabin. Jack's heart was racing as he led the women deeper into the forest, keeping them out of sight. They didn't stop until they reached a small creek hidden among the trees. Jack motioned for them to crouch low. The sound of the men searching the cabin had faded, but Jack knew they wouldn't give up easily. They would be searching the land until they found what they were after. Taya and Sakari were both breathing heavily, but they didn't complain. They understood the danger better than anyone. Jack could see the fear in their eyes, but there was also a determination there. They were fighters, and they would do whatever it took to survive. Jack looked at them, his expression serious. "We can't stay here long. We need to move fast." Sakari nodded, clutching the rifle tightly in her hands. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack paused, considering his options. The men were looking for them, he knew that much. But why? What had they done to make these men come after them? Jack wasn't sure yet, but he had to protect them no matter what. "We'll head for the hills," Jack said. "There's an old hideout up there. We can stay hidden until the storm passes." Taya shook her head. "It's not just the storm we need to hide from," she said quietly. "It's them." Jack looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Who are they?" he asked. Taya's eyes met his, and for the first time, she seemed to hesitate. "They're men from our past," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been hunting us for days." Sakari's eyes flickered with anger, but she said nothing. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. Jack's heart clenched as he realized that these women were in deeper trouble than he had imagined. Whoever these men were, they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. "We'll keep moving," Jack said firmly, "but we need to be careful. These men are dangerous." Taya and Sakari both nodded, their expressions grim. They understood the gravity of the situation. Jack had no idea how long they would be on the run or what dangers lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone harm them, not while he was still breathing. The three of them moved quickly through the woods, staying low to the ground, avoiding the paths the men might take. The sound of the men's voices grew fainter, but Jack knew that it wouldn't be long before they were back on their trail. As the sun began to set, they reached the base of the hills. Jack turned to the women, his voice steady. "We'll rest here for the night. Tomorrow we'll move farther." They nodded in agreement, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. Jack sat down, keeping watch while the women tried to settle in. The night was cold, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had raged outside the cabin. Jack's thoughts raced. What had these women gotten themselves into? And more importantly, how could he help them survive? The night had fallen, and the hills were cloaked in darkness. Jack, Taya, and Sakari huddled together in the cold, trying to stay warm under the shelter of a few scattered trees. The only sound was the wind rustling through the branches and the distant howl of a lone coyote. It was a peaceful kind of silence, but the threat of the men who had been hunting them lingered in the air like a shadow. Jack kept a sharp eye on their surroundings, scanning the hills for any signs of movement. He had no idea where the men were now, but he knew they wouldn't give up easily. They would keep searching until they found what they were looking for. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before they were found. Sakari was sitting on a large rock, her rifle resting across her lap. She hadn't said much since they had made their way into the hills, but Jack could see the tension in her posture. She was used to running, used to being on the move, but this time felt different. This time they had something to fight for. Taya, on the other hand, was pacing back and forth, her eyes darting from the ground to the sky. She had been more distant than usual, her mind clearly occupied with thoughts that Jack knew better than to ask about. He could see the weight of the past pressing down on her, and though he didn't know what had happened to them, he knew it was something that couldn't be easily forgotten. Jack stood up and walked over to Sakari, crouching down beside her. She looked at him for a moment before turning her gaze back to the hills. "We'll make it through this," Jack said quietly. "I promise you I won't let anything happen to you." Sakari didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, she finally spoke. "You don't know what you're up against," she said, her voice low but filled with a certain weariness. "You can't protect us forever." Jack met her eyes, his expression firm. "I don't need to protect you forever. Just long enough for you to find a way to get back to your people." She shook her head, but Jack could see the flicker of hope in her eyes. He didn't know what kind of future they were fighting for, but he was determined to see it through. Just then Taya stopped pacing and turned to face them. Her eyes were narrow, and her face was set in determination. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "They'll find us if we stay here." They couldn't afford to rest for long, not with the men still searching for them. The night was their only cover, and they needed to use it to their advantage. "We'll head to the river," Jack said. "There's an old crossing point I know of. It's not far from here." Without another word, they gathered their things and started walking through the dark hills. The path was rocky, but Jack led the way with confidence. The night was quiet, save for the crunching of the dirt and gravel beneath their boots and the distant rustling of the trees. It was eerie in its silence, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached the riverbank. The water was running fast, swollen with the recent snowmelt. The moonlight shimmered off the surface, casting a soft glow over the scene. Jack paused for a moment, listening intently. The only sound was the rushing water, but he couldn't help but feel like they were on borrowed time. "We'll cross here," Jack said, pointing to a narrow part of the river where the current was slower. "It's the safest place to cross without being seen." Taya and Sakari nodded, and they made their way down to the water's edge. Jack was the first to step into the river, feeling the cold rush up to his knees. The water was icy, but it wasn't as strong here, and he knew they could make it across safely if they moved quickly. Sakari was next, and Taya followed behind her. The river was deep in places, but they managed to keep their footing as they waded through the current. Jack glanced over his shoulder, making sure the women were close behind. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, and Jack couldn't help but feel that it masked the sound of any pursuit. He had to keep his focus on getting them to safety. Once they reached the other side, Jack helped Taya out of the water and turned to Sakari, who was still struggling against the current. With one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her to the bank. "You all right?" Jack asked, his voice full of concern. Sakari nodded, though she looked pale from the cold. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice trembled slightly. They climbed up the riverbank and moved away from the water's edge, their shoes squelching in the mud. They were all soaked through, but the cold didn't matter as much now. They were further from the men, and that was all that mattered. "We'll find shelter further up," Jack said. "But we need to move fast. We don't know how close they are." The three of them kept moving through the dark, their eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of danger. Jack led the way, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. His mind was racing, trying to think of their next move. The men weren't far behind. He could feel it. But Jack wasn't about to let them catch up. Not if he could help it. By the time the sun began to rise, they had reached the foot of the mountain. Jack stopped, breathing heavily from the long walk. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. But this wasn't a storm Jack could ride out. They had to keep moving. Taya and Sakari looked exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. They had been through so much already, and Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. They had been running for days, and Jack had no idea how much longer they could keep it up. "We'll rest here for a bit," Jack said, "but not for long. The moment we stop moving, they'll catch up to us." Taya nodded, and the three of them sat down on a large boulder near the base of the mountain. They were safe for the moment, but Jack knew the danger wasn't over. They had to keep fighting, keep moving until they found a place to truly call home. Sakari leaned against the rock, her eyes tired but resolute. "We'll make it," she said softly.
"We'll find a way to survive."
Jack looked at her, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. "Yes, we will." The sun rose higher in the sky, and for the first time in days, Jack allowed himself to breathe. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They weren't giving up. Not yet.